It's time for the Phil Ferguson Show.
This is Phil Ferguson, and you are listening to the Phil Ferguson Show. This is another best of show. We're digging way back into 2015. Got two segments I think you're going to really enjoy. The first one about investments is Trump versus the S&P 500. It doesn't turn out well for Trump. I know you're not going to be surprised. It was kind of funny because I did this back in 2015, a full year before Trump won the election. So I guess I kind of had a negative attitude of the guy way back then. Not a surprise to me. And after that, we're going to hear an interview also from 2015 with Ellery Schemp. Ellery Schemp was a school-aged young man, and his school was making him read the Bible, and he took the case all the way up to the Supreme Court. The case is called Abington School District versus Schemp, and it was decided in 1963. So it was my great pleasure to have talked to Mr. Schemp a couple of times and have him interview for the show, again, back in 2015. So you should really enjoy that. I will, of course, be back soon with all new content, but until then, enjoy the show. I wanted to talk to you about Donald Trump. And just so that we're clear, I am biased against Donald Trump. I dislike the man. I think he is potentially unstable and not only bad for America, but bad for business. And it genuinely terrifies me that as much as possibly 30% of the Republican electorate might actually vote for this guy. But I've been scared by who people might vote for before, so I guess that's nothing new. There's been a few stories going around about comparing Donald Trump and his performance to index funds, which is my favorite, and I'm delighted that index funds have now reached the level of popular culture. That's a very good sign. I think they're a great place to invest, and maybe next week, I don't know, I get a bazillion show ideas now bubbling around. Talk about how to have more than just one index fund and what you can do with index funds now that you've decided to use them. But for this comparison, we're just going to compare Donald Trump to the S&P 500, which in the long run works really close to the total market. But the big question is, how do you compare Donald Trump to anything? Because his numbers are often kind of sketchy. So what I'm going to go do is I'm going to go back to, and I'm going to use Donald Trump's numbers because I can assume that his numbers are the most optimistic possible number you could put on his investments. It is believed that his father left him about $50 million in 1974, and when Forbes put together their first ever richest people in America, and I believe that was 1982. And by the way, I'm getting a lot of this information from the National Journal. Nationaljournal.com did a nice article on Donald Trump in this situation. But Donald Trump claimed in 1982 that he was worth $400 million. So we're going to start the calendar, the clock, at the beginning of 1982, and assuming that Donald is correct and that he was actually worth every penny of $400 million in 1982 after getting $50 million from his father's estate, and that he invested that money in the S&P 500 and did nothing else. And we fast forward until the very beginning of 2015, or December 31st of 2014, that would give him a net value of about $16 billion. However, today, Donald Trump claims, and at least he did in a press release for his political campaign, which I love the fact that they put it all in capital letters, that Donald Trump is worth $10 billion. So apparently he, like many investors, lost money by not being in the index, and in this case, he's short $6 billion. Of course, different organizations value his assets worth much less. Some optimistic ones are $8 billion, but others will say as little as $3 billion, depending on who you ask and what their spin is. And coincidentally, he has said that he will spend up to $1 billion on his campaign to win the presidential election. But in his own filing, where he has to list assets that he has, he only has, I love this, only $63 million in cash and $13 million in similar holdings and about $200 million in stocks and bonds. So maybe $300 million that he could get his hands on without selling some assets, without selling some buildings, some properties. So it would be very, very difficult for him to spend $1 billion on his campaign. And many wonder if he even has a net worth of $1 billion. But I think it was Forbes probably came up with a more realistic number where, and I was hoping this would pop off my screen here, of several billion. So, I think it's safe to say he's worth several billion. And keep in mind, this is after 4 bankruptcies. And so in the bankruptcy, he's made mistakes. He's able to liquidate some of the debt and allow shareholders to take a loss or allow the government to take loss or other companies that he owes money to. So he turned his claimed $400 million in 1982 into $10 billion instead of $16 billion. And of course, the $10 billion is his claim, but we're going to go from his claim to his claim. He's still short $6 billion, and that is after 4 separate bankruptcies. So that is the success of Donald Trump and his investments.
But in the bullshit department, a businessman can't hold a candle to a clergyman. Because I got to tell you the truth, folks. I got to tell you the truth. When it comes to bullshit, big time, major league bullshit, you have to stand in awe of the all-time champion of false promises and exaggerated claims, religion. No contest. No contest. Religion easily has the greatest bullshit story ever told. Think about it. Religion has actually convinced people that there's an invisible man living in the sky who watches everything you do every minute of every day. And the invisible man has a special list of 10 things he does not want you to do. And if you do any of these 10 things, he has a special place full of fire and smoke and burning and torture and anguish where he will send you to live and suffer and burn and choke and scream and cry forever and ever till the end of time. But he loves you.
All right, everybody, welcome back. This is Phil Ferguson, and you are listening to The Phil Ferguson Show. My very, very special guest today, I'd like to think he's a personal friend of mine, is Ellery Schemp. How are you today, sir?
Oh, it's good to hear from you, Phil. I've loved talking to you.
Oh, you're always so polite. I can only assume that you treat everyone better than me.
Well, I'm looking forward to sharing ideas and thoughts with you.
Well, I'm looking forward to, of course, and we're going to talk about some modern-day stuff, of course, but one of the things I want to make sure we get out there, and I know you and I have talked about this before in a previous show, but there's always new listeners, there's always new activists, there's always new people that haven't heard this story, and I think it's so incredibly important. And the pre-show, you and I were actually talking about a book called In God We Trust. And hang on a second here, and I'm going to pull it up my phone, and I just got to stall for a few seconds to pretend like this is all planned. One Nation Under God, How Corporate America Invented Christian America by Kevin M. Cruz.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
And you said you had a brief talk with him, and he sent you a book?
Yeah, exactly. We had email exchanges, and I mentioned when the book just came out in the middle of the summer, I think, and I mentioned to him that when Congress passed the law and changed the Pledge of Allegiance and added the phrase "In God We Trust" in 1954, in several ways that was a precursor to my beginning to think about this Bible reading and Lord's Prayer practice in the public schools. So it was a kind of backlash, I think, from In God We Trust that led to the Supreme Court case that decided that daily ceremonial devotional readings from the Bible were unconstitutional, a violation of the First Amendment. And obviously the recitation of the Lord's Prayer, which is clearly a sectarian religious prayer, was also unconstitutional. So In God We Trust was a motivator for me. Well, I also like to point out that when we say one nation under God, that is not quite accurate. If you look at a map, we're actually under Canada.
That's funny because I do that when I am compelled to recite the pledge, usually for my local Rotary Club, and they all know that I do it. And there's actually a couple people have joined me in, so we do one nation under Canada.
That's very cute.
It's actually technically correct from a northern hemisphere perspective because one could make the map any direction. I don't know. I'm still torn. I'm thinking maybe I shouldn't even stand, but who wants to make a big scene? But some people...
It's rather bizarre. This is one of the few countries in the world that has any kind of daily activity of reciting a pledge of allegiance to the flag of the United States, blah, 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 blah. I mean, the people in France and Germany, Italy, Greece, they don't do that kind of stuff. They're advanced and civilized nations.
I always thought that if you were compelled every day to say that you pledge allegiance to anything, do you really? I mean...
Well, and it's like religion by rote. Political statement by rote is not any genuine patriotic expression. And it's also very important to know that George Washington and James Madison and Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln, they never recited the pledge because the pledge wasn't written until 1892. And it only became popular during the patriotic fervor and zealotry of World War I. And then it became more established, and the Boy Scouts started using it, and then it sort of moved into conventional society. But none of the patriotic founders ever said it. So it's clearly not a necessary part of American life or American devotion to our values.
Right. And so that happened in 54, and that was a little bee in your bonnet. And, of course, you were in school. And where were you in school?
I was in Abington Senior High School, which is a suburb of Philadelphia in Pennsylvania.
And they were compelling everyone to listen to...
Well, there was law in Pennsylvania that required that 10 verses, and I quote here, 10 verses of the Holy Bible must be read or caused to be read at the beginning of each school day in every school classroom throughout the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And so, obviously, in the early grades, the teacher read the Bible. And by junior high school, teachers were pretty bored with this, and so they would say to the kids, all right, Susie, you read the Bible today, and Charlie, you read it tomorrow, and we'll go around the room, and that's how it went. And that continued until my senior years in high school when they had a public address system installed, and then somebody read the Bible over the loudspeaker system.
Now, did they read all of it?
But it was required, and the penalties for not doing this were very stiff. A teacher would be fired immediately if she didn't read the Bible.
Oh, that's terrible. Now, did they read all of it, or did they pick and choose? Did they have, like...
All you had to do was read 10 verses. And so when the time came for the kids, hardly anybody remembered when it was going to be their turn. They hadn't done any preparation. And so what you'd do is you'd come in and, somebody would say, oh, it's your turn to read the Bible. And you would stumble around the room and look for the darn thing, open it at random, and then read it. And the only Bible that was provided was the King James Version. So that's a little bit difficult to read, especially if you're in 7th or 8th grade, but anyway, and you haven't practiced, and you have no idea what you're reading because you haven't seen the text before. Right. So people would stumble through it, read it rather badly, and after you finish 10 verses, you had done your duty, and that was it. But I always thought it was quite amusing because when they refer to the Holy Bible, a lot of people just don't know that the Catholic Bible is substantially different from the Protestant Lutheran Bible. The Catholic Bible contains additional books that Luther decided he didn't like in the Bible, and they have different numberings of the Ten Commandments, and they have different, slightly different words in the Lord's Prayer. And that's one of the things I began to notice, actually. That the Catholic kids said the Lord's Prayer in a slightly different way than the Protestant kids did. And, of course, the Lord's Prayer is not in any way Jewish, not in any way Muslim or Hindu or Buddhist or non-believer. So, I mean, it was a totally sectarian imposition on the school children.
So everyone's doing that every day, and they, like you said, they put in the loudspeaker system, and you decided to have your own little personal protest. What was it that you did?
Well, I fortunately had some very good friends and very good family, and I talked over whether this was a violation of the First Amendment, where it says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And I thought this is clearly establishing a sectarian Christian practice in the schools, and a violation, therefore, of the separation of church and state, a violation of the idea that we should be a secular society that neither hinders nor favors religion. So I, in order to point out that the Bible was not the only holy book in the world, I brought a copy of the Koran to school, which I had borrowed from one of my friend's father's library. And I didn't know a thing about Islam at the time or the Koran or anything. I just knew it was a different holy book. And so I brought this to school, and one of the requirements was that during Bible reading you had to put away all of your other work. You couldn't finish your algebra homework or something. You were supposed to sit at your desk and listen very attentively. And so I very deliberately opened the Quran and read it quietly to myself. I didn't make a fuss about it, but I violated that rule, and I did not stand for the Lord's Prayer. So that brought the matter to the attention of this homeroom teacher. And I was a junior in high school at this time, so I was 16, I guess. And he said, well, you know, you've got to be following the school rules. And I said, well, as a matter of religious conscience, I could no longer do that anymore. And he was very befuddled and sent me off to the high school principal, who was equally befuddled. I said, well, and he said it was a matter of respect and there's 1,600 other students in the school, and they're all obeying the rule and listening to the Bible. Why don't you? And I said, well, I have a respect for the U.S., the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and that leads me to a different perspective. And then he decided that he didn't know what else to do, so he sent me to the high school guidance counselor, who was very keen to inquire whether I was having difficulties at home or having difficulties with my father or having difficulties with respect for authority, and on. This went for a while, and I said, no, don't have any difficulties with my dad whatsoever. I just have a difference of opinion about Bible reading.
And they were having a hard time either wrapping their head around that or trying to figure out what to do about it.
Precisely.
And what they ended up deciding to do.
The principal went home that afternoon and looked up the Constitution and read the First Amendment. But anyway, I came home, and after a while they sent me back to regular classes, and nothing much happened. And I came home that evening and recited the day's events to my folks over dinner. And my father suggested that maybe I should write to the American Civil Liberties Union, which I did. And I typed out a letter with my two fingers on my dad's typewriter, and sent it off to the ACLU in Philadelphia, together with $10. That turned out to be quite significant because the ACLU was feeling poor. And then, by the way, $10 is worth in 1956 is equivalent to about $90 today. I'm informed. So they got the letter, and they thought that the $10 was pretty nifty. If a kid could save this money out of his chores and allowance, that he might be pretty serious. But it took them a long time to make up their mind about this. And they first, of course, called up and wanted to talk to my folks and asked, to determine whether we were a bunch of kooks or not, and whether we were serious. And they had to make their own determination whether this was a winnable case and how they're going to pursue it, and on and on. That took a better part of a year and a half. And finally, a cooperating attorney, Henry W. Sawyer, from a famous Philadelphia law firm, joined the case and prepared the briefs, and we filed them in federal district court in Philadelphia. And so on August 5th of 1958, the first hearing was held in which we challenged the Pennsylvania law and asked the court to declare it unconstitutional. Of course, the other side, the school district and the state of Pennsylvania, brought their own attorneys to the case, and so there was a contest. I do remember it quite clearly. Not only was I called to testify, and my brother Roger and my sister Donna and my mother and father were all put on the stand to testify whether my readings from the King James Version of the Bible were in accord with our religious teachings. And we were members of a Unitarian church, so they obviously were not in accord with our teachings and understandings and our humanist kind of outlook on the world. So, but I do remember it very well because it took place on August 5th, 1958, which happens to be my birthday. And I thought that was kind of funny.
Oh, very nice. So this took a couple years to get to the Supreme Court.
Oh, it took 7 years before there was a final decision, I'll tell you. So from 1958, that was when the first court hearing came, and then the court deliberated. That took 2 days for all the testimony and arguments, and the court thought about it for, I forget now, 5 or 6 months or so, and finally we won a decision, 3-0. The court agreed completely with us. The district court ruled that the Pennsylvania law was unconstitutional, and then the practice should stop. But of course, in anticipating that it would be appealed to the Supreme Court, they stayed the opinion, so that therefore it didn't have any effect. And then the school district had to decide, and they had a very emotional meeting in which the people came in Abington Township and voted to raise our taxes in order that they could mount a legal argument and appeal it to the Supreme Court. We were in the audience, so we had to hear them argue that they wanted to raise taxes to argue against us. Anyhow, so finally the case reached the Supreme Court. Then a funny thing happened. The legislature in Pennsylvania, in its wisdom, decided to change the law. Now, when we won the original decision, the court ruled that the practice in Pennsylvania, the law requiring Bible reading and the practice of the recitation of the Lord's Prayer, was a violation of both the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, where it says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And so we won on both grounds, that this was a violation of our free exercise rights, which was not to be indoctrinated or proselytized. Anyhow, so the Pennsylvania legislature changed the law and added a provision that a child could be excused from the morning devotions. And incidentally, these were called morning devotions, so the religious nature was unassailable. So the Supreme Court, always liking to duck controversial issues, sent the case back to the district court and said, well, why don't you reconsider your opinion in the light of the changed law? And so that was every one of these activities, was a year and a half, 2 years or something. So, but then, and by this time I was off to college at Tufts University up here in Boston, and the court considered the case again and said that even though the law had been changed, it didn't change their opinion, that it was still a violation of the Establishment Clause, in which the government was seeming to favor one religion over another or favoring religion over non-religion, and that they weren't even sure that it solved the free exercise clause problem, because how can a child be excused from the Bible reading? Well, the only way, even if you don't have a loudspeaker, if you have a loudspeaker system, it floods the whole building, so you can't, nothing to do about it. Even if you don't have that, what would a child do? Get up and go out and stand in the hallway and then come back in? Well, that means the child has to self-identify as being a dissenter, has to go, and it's often a punishment. A teacher says, oh, you go stand in the hallway because you've been a bad boy. And so it identifies, standing in the hallway as undesirable, or a sign of being a naughty person. So that puts a taint around it, puts a taint around dissent, and leads to taunting and bullying and all sorts of things, right? So the court very much agreed with us, and then so we won again, 3-0, and again it got appealed to the Supreme Court. And in the meanwhile, another case had started in Baltimore. It started in 1960 by Madeline Murray, and Madeline Murray who became famous as an atheist and founded the American Atheist Organization and put a modern-day atheism on the map, more as it were. So her case was almost identical to ours. There was a Bible reading and a prayer practice in the Baltimore and Maryland schools, where her two sons, Garth and Bill, were in school. And she brought the case in the Maryland state courts. And state courts are typically prone to uphold state laws. So we had the advantage of being in federal court, where there's kind of a more neutral decision perspective on it. Anyhow, so her case had wound up through the Maryland courts, and she lost at the Maryland Supreme Court level. The Maryland Supreme Court ruled that the Maryland's practices were constitutional. So she appealed to the Supreme Court. And by sheer accident of timing, our two cases, that is the second appeal on the school board and her appeal from Maryland, reached the Supreme Court at almost identical times, within, I don't know, a couple of weeks of each other. And in the spring of 1963, we are now, so all the way up to 1963. So the Supreme Court recognized that the two cases presented substantially the same issue, and so there's a procedure in which the court consolidates them or joins them, and so that they issue one opinion for both cases. And so the full name, and all of its glory, whatever, is School District of Abington Township versus Schemp and Murray versus Curlett, and that's the actual name of the whole case. And so in June of 1963, the Supreme Court issued its opinion, and it was a wonderful opinion. It was 8-1. Now, you may recall how often we have Supreme Court decisions today, 5-4. If you're lucky, 6-3. This was 8-1, in which they ruled that the Schemps and the Murrays were correct, that the practice in Pennsylvania was a violation of the First Amendment to the Constitution, and the practices of Bible reading, devotional Bible reading, and prayer in the public schools had to stop. And that affected the laws in about 30 states or so, 32 states. And so all over the country, school children no longer were subjected to Bible reading and prayer practices.
So
and of course,
single-handedly,
a little bit of outrage from that.
Yeah, single-handedly as a 16-year-old, you kicked God out of every school in the nation.
Yes. No, well, not single-handedly, with the help of the ACLU and my parents. And, yes.
I understand. And now, Ellery, if we can, I'd like to talk about some modern-day things and what the Supreme Court is doing today, and what kind of thoughts do you have on that?
Well, I'm very wary of where this present-day Supreme Court is going. It's very significant that the court has been captured by conservative Catholics. 6 of the 9 justices, that represents 67% of the court, are now Catholic, and 5 of these are part of the ultra-extreme majority of the court, Roberts and Thomas and Alito and Kennedy from time to time. They're all they've adopted a Catholic doctrine and all these things, and the Catholic doctrine has emerged. At one time, the Catholics were quite the Catholic Church's official bishops and position was that we are a secular nation, and there should be separation of church and state. But then they came about in the late 1940s, early 1950s, in order to distinguish us from the godless atheists. They adopted a new philosophy, and the philosophy was you're either for us or against us. That is to say that if you have a secular, humanistic, non-religious position with regard to separation of church and state, that means that you're actually anti-religious. And so by changing their outlook, they essentially defined neutrality out of existence. So they don't believe that you can be religiously neutral. They don't believe that you can be secular. Secular just means without regard to religion. It's not. It doesn't mean anti-religion. So that the Catholic philosophy is quite at odds with the ideas of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and the traditional understanding from the letter to the Danbury Baptists about where religious plurality and religious diversity, what that means in terms of American society. So, and we see the outcome of this, the results of this, in the decisions about the Hobby Lobby decision, in which the court promoted religious faith, religious belief, of any kind, to be superior to the laws. I mean, that's just a bizarre ruling, but it's going to have large consequences. Already is having large consequences. That a church group, a Catholic girls' school, whatever, can decide what laws they think are violating their religious conscience and decide not to obey them. Well, I mean, I think that's just absurd. Laws are passed in a democracy by a majority of the people and their representatives, and the courts interpret them. And it just as a matter of religious faith, you can't go around saying, well, I don't agree with that law, I don't agree with that law. I mean, how about if I have a religious faith that says I don't believe in red lights, I have a religious faith that I believe in smoking pot? Does that mean I can just go ahead and do all these things just because my religious faith? And the key word, of course, here, a sincere religious belief, that's the phrase the court used. Well, I think that's an absurd position, and I think it's very bad for society.
Well, a couple thoughts come to mind is obviously we've come a long way from the famous Kennedy speech where he had to disavow that if elected president, he would not let the Catholic Church control him and that he would do what's best for the people, not
Absolutely.
What's best for Catholicism. And now we've come kind of full circle, and what you're talking about, of course, and everyone gets to follow and choose their own rules. And I think the thing that's even more bizarre with Hobby Lobby is not only is it a sincerely held religious belief, but apparently a corporation can hold a religious belief.
Yeah. Excellent point, Phil. Yeah, I mean, how can a corporation have a belief? I mean, I can understand my neighbor, whatever he wants to believe. But a corporation, I mean, with stockholders and a group of people, no, the idea is so absurd that it's just really disgusting. And, you know, here we look on the candidates for president.
Oh, my goodness.
Jindal and Cruz, Santorum, they're all kind of Catholic jihadis. Well, of course, they're not engaged in violence. I don't mean that. But they're jihadis in the sense that they want to abolish the right to use birth control. They want to abolish, of course, abortion. That's horrible for them. But even birth control and contraception, they're following the Catholic doctrine. And, you know, that's a very big threat. I just don't understand the evangelical, conservative Catholic obsession with sex and obsession with who has orgasms. I mean, it's really sick. Why not just let the people be alone and do their darn thing? And it has nothing to do with public morality. All right, obviously we have laws against rape and whatever, but what you do in the privacy of your bedroom, why is that should be any concern to Republican candidates?
Well, I think these things swing through time, especially after listening to this wonderful book that we mentioned earlier. You know, they pass these general ideas about God, and most people got into the anti-communist fervor, and they were okay with that. But when they start getting to specifics, people start to push back until we had abortion, and there Protestants and Catholics could unite under the Catholic dogma of not allowing abortions. And at least for now, they seem to be fighting together pretty good. But I think they've made a mistake in continuing this battle. And I'm torn. I wish they wouldn't battle, but I'm glad that they are in a way with this with the gay rights and the gay marriage, because more and more people are being repelled by church. They're being repelled by religion, and they are on the losing side. And it's just a matter of time, and they're going to lose. And it's mostly done now. They just don't know it.
You make a very good point, and I'm kind of happy that we finally say, well, okay, if you're same sex and you want to get married, go ahead and do it. That's not of my business, and it doesn't. I mean, it's a great myth that they promoted that same-sex marriage would destroy traditional heterosexual marriage, and of course that just turned out to be utter nonsense. I do have I made an interesting observation the other day that they often use the Bible. Quoting from Leviticus and Romans, a couple passages that suggest that God doesn't approve of gay marriage or gay sex or something, or homosexuals, I guess. And so they quote that. Well, I'm so happy that we don't have Bible reading in the public schools any longer, because surely people would have picked those passages again and again and again to discriminate against gays. And gays, kids in high school, would have to hear these lessons every day, or these readings every day, and I'm glad they don't do that. And the other thing I thought was funny about this is that they thought that quoting the Bible would bring the argument to their side, that everybody would say, okay, the Bible is against homosexuality, therefore we're not going to approve of gay marriage and all that sort of thing, or gay practices even. And what happened? What happened was the effect was to dethrone the Bible. That young people, came to think that, well, I have a gay friend and it seems perfectly sane and normal to me, and I don't care, and it's not my cup of tea, but I love my friend. And so the overall effect was to reduce respect for the Bible as a center of morality. Of course, the Bible has very little to do with morality in the first place, but except for this obsession with sex. But the effect of this has been, of the anti-gay arguments has been to dethrone the role of the Bible, and I'm very happy about that.
Now, I know I often hear, and I'm dying to find out what you have to say about this, that America was founded as a Christian nation. What are your thoughts on that?
It's absolutely not true. It was founded by people who were very secularly inclined. They had seen the results of the religious strife in Europe between the Protestants and the Catholics, and wars and this and the wars of that. And when they wrote, when James Madison put into the First Amendment that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, I mean, exactly what he said. Now, it's a very important point. The Constitution of the United States does not have a single mention of God. It does not have a single mention of any commandments. It does not even request in the preamble, we ask for divine providence or divine something or other on our nation. It says, we the people do ordain. Well, that's a very humanist statement, we the people. And now, by contrast, I think let's look at the Bible. Does the Bible provide any model for democracy or our freedoms or our liberties? Not a bit. There's not a single mention in the Bible about freedom of religion. There's not a single mention in the Bible about freedom of speech or freedom of assembly or freedom of the press. The Bible doesn't even mention elections, doesn't mention the word democracy doesn't appear in the Bible. So the Bible provides absolutely no model whatsoever for our country or our society or our government.
And I know, of course, many of my listeners will be aware of these things, that if you wear mixed fabrics, you have to be killed. If you eat shellfish, you have to be killed. Adultery is punishable by death. But we ignore all of these in the United States, and the religious majority is not clamoring for shellfish to be punishable by eating shellfish to be punishable by death. Why one or two things? What is it? Control?
Well, I mean, it's always very selective, and this is what religious people do all the time. I mean, they the Seventh-day Adventists and Jehovah's Witnesses comb through the Bible and pick out certain passages that they think justifies their religion, as opposed to everybody else who's in apostasy or a blasphemer or a heretic, whatever. That's why we have so many schisms. I mean, there's somebody counted up one time that there were something like 290 different denominations in the United States. 290. I mean, we all know the big major ones, but there's zillions of little churches and little groups and Assembly of God and this and it's because they each wants to find something that makes them unique. What makes religion unique is that its emphasis on superstition, old ways of thinking, refusal to adopt to new thoughts and new ideas. So I just can't think that further religious fervor is actually going to be good for the country or good for the individuals who believe these things. I mean, magical thinking is a very bad thing. It leads you to follow the wrong courses in medicine and follows the wrong course in life. There just is not any such thing as divine intervention, God coming into changing natural laws, the laws of nature just to please you. I mean, the whole idea is nonsensical. And this whole notion of an afterlife, that's a very pernicious idea. And I trace that, I might link that on to the jihadis who did all these horrible massacres in Paris and many other places, of course. This notion that there's an afterlife in which you're going to get rewards or punishment is just a bad idea. And it's been the cause of so much hurt and horror in the world because people believe that you do some killings, you do some unmerciful things to people, and then God will reward you in the afterlife. It's a very, very bad idea.
Absolutely, Ellery. And where can our listeners find more about you? Is there a website? Is it just the Wikipedia? Is there anything that are you doing Twitter? Are you on social media?
I don't do much of the social stuff.
Okay.
The Wikipedia article, if you really want to read about the case, there's a program, and I don't have the exact website here, but it's called the Oyez Project. That's Oyez at Cornell. And there they have a complete listing, a discussion of the case from a legal point of view, and it even has recordings that you can download of the actual arguments, oral arguments that were made in front of the Supreme Court in 1963. And I think that's interesting. And so the Oyez Project comes from the phrase that the clerk of the court says when the court is ready to meet, "Oyez, oyez, come here and make your arguments." So Oyez at Cornell. You'll find it quickly on Google.
On the Google. Well, Ellery, again, thank you so much for being on the Phil Ferguson Show, and thank you for, quite a few years ago, bringing that Quran in and standing up for all of our rights. We really appreciate it, and we talk about we're moving forward on the shoulders of giants. Whether you like it or not, you kind of get to be one of those giants. So.
I'm so thankful there are people like you and your listeners who will carry on. I'm not going to be here all that much longer. I'm 75, and it's wonderful that there are younger people who come along and take up the flag and the cause. Because if you don't pay attention to this all the time, it's going to get eroded. And the Hobby Lobby is one example of that. The Greece, New York decision about prayers and city council meetings was another case like that. And so it takes, as the ACLU says, it takes constant vigilance. And I think it's very important for all of us to be members of organizations like Americans United or the ACLU or Freedom from Religion Foundation, because those are the way that our lone voices get amplified by being a part of a bigger organization and bigger group.
Well, I love that call to action, and we'll wrap up on that. Once again, thank you so much for your time, and I appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you very much, Phil. And I look forward to you letting me know how I can hear it.
Of course. Have a good night.
He loves you and he needs money. He always needs money. He's all powerful, all perfect, all knowing, and all wise. Somehow, just can't handle money. Religion takes in billions of dollars. They pay no taxes, and they always need a little more. Now, you talk about a good bullshit story. Holy shit.
You're listening to The Phil Ferguson Show.
Hopefully you enjoyed the show as much as I enjoyed making it. And like I told you before, I'm away. This was a best of episode, so I'm not really here. So I'm not going to read reviews from iTunes or Stitcher. If you'd like to make one, I'd be honored to read it in a week or two when I get back into my home office. Until then, ciao.
Are not appealing. In fact, I'm starting to get the uh-oh feeling. And my mama said my special parts are just for me. So why in the world are you trying to creep? shady old van. I think he wants to mess with my purity plan.
Stop! Don't touch me there. This is my no-no square. Stop! Don't touch me there. This is my no-no square.
My square's not a circle or a period or dot. It's just my one little very old spot. So keep your grubby little dirty little hands off me. Why won't you respect my privacy? I just want to be left all alone, so step off me and go back home. I'll tell you again if you're not aware that this is my own no-no square.
Stop! Don't touch me there. This is my no-no square. Stop! Don't touch me there.